Hello everyone, it's Channin here for Waffle Flower Crafts. In today's technique video, I will be making some contact paper masks and combining that with some heat embossing. I'll be using these Waffle Flower products today. This is the poinsettia stamp set. It's a layering stamp set, really beautiful. I'll be using the poinsettia matching die as well. I'll also be using this Stitch Layers die set. I'll be using the largest die from this set. And finally, the Lacy Squares. This is the Lacy Squares die set. I'll be using this die right here. It's kind of got a stitched design. This is the contact paper I'm using. I got this entire roll at the 99-cent store, so this whole roll was actually less than $1. It has a nice grid on the back, and on the front I picked out a contact paper that had kind of like a grid design on the front. I just think that's easier to work with for lining things up, just in case, though today's is just some simple die cutting. So I've got my die cutting machine here and a scrap of this contact paper. I'm going to take that poinsettia die, just lay it down on the contact paper and die cut it. So nothing different here, just normal die cutting, just like you would do with paper. Now the contact paper has it's adhesive on one side and it has a lining or a paper lining on the back. So I have to remove that back before I stick it down. So there's my mask, and I went ahead and die cut with the Lacy Square die a square panel with 110-pound white cardstock. And now I'm going to remove the backing on this contact paper mask and just center it here on the panel. And it is sticky, but surprisingly, this contact paper, all contact papers, all the ones that I've used have not been super sticky, and you can remove it. So it works great for masks. It really works well, and it's really cheap. So that's the wonderful part about it. So now I'm just covering the whole panel with some Versamark embossing ink. And now I'm going to pour on some embossing powder. This is gold embossing powder. I'm going to carefully pick this up and do about half at a time. And yes, I'm pouring it directly over the mask. It will stick to the mask, but I found that this is the best way to get clean results. I did try to remove the mask and then pour on the embossing powder, but a lot of the embossing powder stuck to the negative area where the mask was, and I had to do a lot of cleanup with my brush. So this is, I found, to be the best way to get a nice clean a panel. Now I did remove a little bit here on the edges with my fingers, but that's alright. I can easily touch that up with some more embossing powder once I've removed my mask. So I'm just going to scoop up some of that embossing powder and pour it on anywhere I kind of picked up some of the powder off of it. Pretty simple. And you saw how I was able to remove that mask without too much trouble. I did use tweezers to kind of hold down the panel while I peeled it off the back. So these contact masks are great for things like this. The only time that they're not, or for ink blending, if you're going to put some masks down and do some ink blending on top, the only thing that I found that they're not so great for is when you are stamping on top of the contact paper. You can sometimes pull your mask up because it is kind of slick on the surface and kind of sticks to those clear stamps. So that's the only time I've found that them not to be so great, but other than that, these masks work really well for lots of purposes. But you cannot stamp on them. So if you ever need to stamp and cut out something, they don't work so for that as well. But they do definitely have a good function, and since contact paper is so inexpensive, it's a good thing to just add to your craft room. So I'm just heat setting this, and that panel is done. I'll hold it up here to the camera so you can see it better. Really pretty embossing, just a nice, really, anytime you incorporate some embossing, especially large quantities of embossing, heat embossing, it really does make a card look much more elegant. So now in this negative space, I'm going to take the layers of this poinsettia and stamp them in here. I'm going to start with the layer that has the stem. I just found this was the easiest way, since the stem was easiest to get centered into that negative space, so I started there. So I'm just going to pick it up here once I've got it all lined up with my MISTI, and I'm going to use some Distress Oxides for this. This is Twisted Citron. I'm just going to clean the stamp off a little bit with my fingers. Some of the oils from my hands helps the ink stick a little bit better. Even still though, I will be stamping all of these layers twice just to make sure I get a nice crisp layer. I like to do this anytime I already have my stamp positioned in my MISTI. It's just so easy to do. So inking it up one more time, and I'm going to stamp this one more time just to make sure it's nice, clean, crisp, and vibrant. So I'm going to clean that off, and I've already now positioned the next layer of the poinsettia stamp. I'm going to ink this one up in candied apple. And again, I will stamp this twice as well. So stamping it once, and then I'll stamp it again. So once we finish stamping this, we're moving on to the next layer, the third layer in this poinsettia flower. I'm going to use abandoned coral for this. So I'm going to ink that up, and again, stamping once and twice. And you do have to be careful here. These Distress Oxides do stay wet a little bit longer, so just be careful when you're lining your next layer up not to smudge too, just be careful not to smudge and drag a lot. So this last layer of the poinsettia is just the leaves, and I'm using Lucky Clover to stamp these leaves and basically the center of the flowers as well. I really like how this flower pops off of the gold embossed background. I think that little white outline from the dies really helped that too. I think it's just a really pretty look. Okay, so these are two A2 panels, top folding panels. The red is a regular A2 panel, but the white was a regular A2 panel, and then I trimmed it down both the vertical and horizontal side just 1/8 of an inch just to make it a little bit smaller because it's going to fit inside. I'm going to adhere these back to back because I will be die cutting the front of that red panel just to add a little detail. Now I can't use my scoreboard because this is a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to fold it over by hand. But you could make an A2 card out of the white cardstock and then trim it down after you've scored the fold line. So now I die cut the panel, or the red card base with the stitched layers die, the largest die. And now I'm going to adhere the red card base to the white card base. And remember, the white card base is just a little bit smaller, so it fits nicely inside there. So you'll only see the red. And I'm using some Tombow Mono multi-liquid adhesive here. This is my favorite liquid adhesive. Really love it. It's very strong stuff. And I'm now going to add some adhesive to the back of the panel that was die cut by the stitched layers die. This is just going to add a nice little detail to the front of the card. I tried embossing, and I actually liked the deeper, darker impressions I got by actually die cutting. So that's why I'm die cutting as opposed to dry embossing. And now I'll just glue the back. And adding this inner card base does two things. My red is really thin cardstock, so I think it's only 65. I don't really like that weight for cards. But the white liner inside is 110, so this adds some nice thickness to the card as well. Okay, so I went ahead and die cut a tag and a little string. You can see them on the lower right of the screen. These are both from the poinsettia matching die set. I'll hold them up here so you can see. I went ahead and die cut those, and now I'm going to stamp on top of them. I chose to die cut them first just because the poinsettia stamp set has a tag image that corresponds with this die, but if I stamped the tag image, I wouldn't have room to stamp my whole sentiment, which is Merry Christmas. So I just decided not to stamp the tag outline and just die cut it, and then I'll stamp the sentiment. Then I have room for the sentiment inside the tag. And then the little string, I could have stamped it first, but I just thought I'd do both the same way just to save the trouble. So that's a little string there, and now I'm going to remove the first part of my sentiment, which is Merry. I'm just going to have it say Merry Christmas. And I'm going to stamp these in the same ink color, which is Abandoned Coral, so that's why I'm stamping them at once. And this is just a scrap of a 110-pound white cardstock that I die cut the string and tag from. I'm using this to kind of keep my tag and little string in place when I stamp on them. And if they pop out, I can just pop them right back into that little negative space, so it keeps it nice and snug and perfectly aligned. I'm inking up the sentiment, which is Mary right now, the first part of my sentiment, and the string, again with the Abandoned Coral distressed ink. And I'll stamp these, and again I will stamp these twice. And then you can see they popped off a little bit there, they stick to the stamp, but that's okay. I just pop it right back into that negative space, and I can ink it up and stamp it again. So one more time I'm going to ink this up and stamp this. And then I will be done with that little string, but I do have to stamp the second part of my sentiment. So I'm going to pull that little string out and hold it up to the camera so you can see. It's so tiny but so cute. And then now I'm going to stamp the Christmas, the second part of my sentiment, in the Candied Apple. So this is the red. Kind of using red and coral for this card. I do make a second card with a coral card base as opposed to the red. I just like how the two complement each other. And that's done. And again, I have to be careful because again, this Distress Oxide ink does stay wet for a longer time period than dye ink, so you do have to be careful when you handle these so you don't smudge. You can heat set this or just let it air dry. I actually heat set this off camera here, and then I come back and assemble the card, which is what I'm doing next. Okay, so here are all my parts. I have a square of craft foam that I cut to fit behind that square panel. I'm just going to use some more of that Tombow Mono Liquid adhesive. This is a great adhesive for the craft foam. It's really strong and holds it very well. And I'm going to angle it here. I thought I was going to let it dry a little bit with the weight on top, but I want to go ahead and move on to all the next steps. So I'll just kind of hold this down a little bit while I add the other parts, add some glue to the other elements of the card. So I'm going to angle it just a little bit here. It is centered, but it is angled a little. And I use some more of the Tombow Liquid adhesive. And now I'm going to adhere my sentiment and the little string on top. And once I add all these, if I do notice that I have any sides kind of poking up that aren't drying flat, I could add some weight on top of this. I like to use the platform, the heaviest platform from my die cutting machine to kind of help weight things down. It's just handy, it's right there. And that's all done. So pretty simple, but a nice and elegant card. You can see the nice detail the stitch layers die adds just a little bit more interest to the card. And I'll show you the second card I made here in just a second. This is the one I made with the coral, so exact same combo or color combo, except I just used a coral card base instead of a red. So they're really nice and complement each other. I hope you guys enjoyed today's technique. And if you want any more information on the products I use, please visit waffleflower.com, and you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook for more creative ideas. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful day.